My name is William. I've been receiving requests for a tutorial on how to make flutes. My point of view camera's got a out of focus lens. I haven't yet corrected that, so I've opted to just take a series of photographs and go into the details of how I make a flute. It's pretty freewheeling, I guess, is the way I do it. And this is totally unrehearsed, so if I fill in the blanks with some kind of sounds like and all that, just keep in mind I'm trying to figure out what to cover next, that kind of thing. So I guess the first thing you need to figure out is what kind of tools do you need to do the job. I use a lathe, or not a lathe, a router, although I have a lathe on the way. But in my early days of making flutes, I didn't have a router, so I used a gauge, or a gouge, excuse me, and I simply gouged out the bores and the slow air chambers by hand. Very slow, tedious process. You can pick one of these up for somewhere in the vicinity of $30 to $50, depending on the quality. My experience is if you buy a cheap tool, you're going to have a hard time with it. So you want to just buy what you can afford. If you're going to spend around 50 bucks for one of these, you can get a router and a router table thing for around 100. So make life, if you're going to do this more than one flute, it might pay you to get a router. For the forming of the true sound hole and all that, I used a set of hobby files. I picked up a set like this one down at Harbor Freight for $5 approximately. You've got your flat files, and you've got a coarse one and a fine one, and you've got some triangle files and a square file and a round file. Just about everything you would need. Well, it is everything you would need to make a nice, well-formed true sound hole. I don't have a lathe yet, it's on order, but this is what I currently use. This is spoke shave, and you just take it with both hands and you secure your flute, and you begin scraping away the wood, and it takes a nice controlled scrape so that you're not going to cut in too deeply into the wood and all that. You just kind of pull it along. I do one end of the flute first, then I flip it around, do the other end. It means you got to clamp the flute, so you got to be real careful. If it's already been bored out, which it has, when you get to this stage, you can crack your flute pretty easy. So you got to clamp it enough to keep it from moving, but not so hard as to break it. Kind of an awkward way to work, but it does work. Okay, so I guess the first thing to cover would be selection of your materials. I go down to Home Depot and I pick up a piece of pine 1x3, and or 1x2, excuse me. I'm not. If you're making a drone, you want to get a wide one, but a 1x2 is not actually 1 inch by 2 inch, but it's pretty much the right size for what is needed for making a flute. So you want to look down the blank and make sure that it is straight, it's not bowed. If you get one that's bowed and you try to force it into shape, it's while it's curing and all, it's trying to come back to the bow that it had. Just makes problems. If I can't find a good piece of wood that's not bowed, I just wait. There's nothing so urgent that you got to settle for something that's just going to give you a headache. I always try to find something with a nice grain in it, and I always, if it's got a knot, I don't even consider the board. Knots are just a problem unless you've got enough of that board, and it's especially nice that you can make the blanks without having to deal with the knots. If you're using a lathe and you're turning and you've got knots, that presents problems. Some knots can actually come out, leaving an unwanted hole in your wood. those kinds of things. So, you know, pick your piece of wood that's going to give you the least amount of grief and give you the best look. Once you've got that, figure out how long you want to cut the blank for the given flute that you're going to make. I'm not going to give instructions on any particular flute. I'll just talk about how you arrive at what you're making, how you get the right pitch and all of that. So once you've got your flute blanks figured out, the thing that you operate on is this area right here. This would be the slow air chamber. That can be the width of your palm. I make them 4 inches long. They can be smaller or larger, but 4 gets the job done. And for most flutes, it makes a nice, well-balanced looking flute to have that 4 inches on the mouth end of the flute. So that's something that's up for discussion, how long you want to make that. But I usually make it a hand width, which is about 4 inches. Then the wall between the slow air chamber and the bore itself, that is 3/8, half inch width of a thumb. I've seen people make them really long, over an inch. Some people make them really short. I find one that's around 3/8 of an inch to a half, maybe the thumb width. It works fine. The bore length itself is 18:1. So if you have a 1-inch bore, you're going to have an 18-inch long flute. If you're making a flute in the key of, say, G minor, the bore is going to be about 15.5 inches long, and somewhere around 5/8 or 3/4, 7/8. Actually, probably closer to 7/8. I don't have a calculator out here, but you'd probably want a 7/8 bore, maybe 3/4 with about 15.5 inch length. When you cut your blanks, you want to leave extra. I usually throw a couple of inches on there. It's probably overkill, but I like to have plenty of room for error. So when I calculate, if I get a 15-inch bore, I'll cut the thing to 17 inches. And there's other good reasons why you might want to cut them longer, and I'll get into that later. So the first thing, again, figure out what you're going to do and make your marks. So this would represent the end of the bore. This would represent the beginning of the slow air chamber, and this would be the mouth end of the slow air chamber. So once you get those laid out, then you probably want to make a center line down here on both of these, so that you can line up and do whatever you need to do. If you're going to do it with a gouge, it'd be good to mark off the extents of the bore on both sides and do it so that it's uniform. You want them to match up good when you glue them together. If you're using a router, that isn't real important, but you do want a good center line. And the thing you want to do with this, before you even mark anything off, you want to look at the grain of the halves, and you can flip them end to end, flip them over, match them together, and look at them. And on the side of the flute where it's the seam where they come together, you're looking for something that's going to give you the best looking match of grain. If you just throw them together, you're liable to have a piece of grain coming up that's looking real nice, and then it's cut off in a straight line, and then there's no grain on the other half of the flute. So you got this grain that's going up there and stopping. It makes the seam real obvious. But if you make a flute out of say a 6-foot piece of pine, it's going to have similar grain on the whole piece of wood. So when you cut your sections, put them together, if you flip them around a little bit, you'll find one that looks, when it's done, it'll look almost like it's a solid piece of wood. So that's just an aside for you. So then you take it out and you you do your routing, and let's see, that's not the right one. This is the one. So when you get them routed, this is what it looks like. This is not to scale. This is extremely long for a Native American style flute. So you want to keep in mind that my modeling here is not to scale. It's just a representation so that you can see. So here's that barrier in between the slow air chamber and the bore of the flute. Keep in mind when I talk about directions, this is the foot end of the flute, or the south end. This is the mouth end of the flute, or the north end of the flute. So north and south. So it's south, north, mouth end, foot end. When I make flutes, I make the holes. First hole is at the lowest, the closest to the south end of the flute. So I use that as number 1, and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've seen other people say this is hole 1, and when they work their way the other way. But for what I'm doing, hole 1 is the lowest note on the flute, closest to the foot. Okay, so after you've got them routed like this, then you need to make the flue area. And see if I can find that real quick. Here it is. All right. So this is what this is the beginning stage of the sound generation mechanism. So if you take a look here, I've got a beveled edge here, and this is, I would make this much more rounded, but before I glue the flute together, I get the mechanism into this condition. This eventually is going to be 1/32 of an inch deep. I always start with it deeper than it needs to be, because the way I make flutes, the fashioning of the true sound hole, the splitting edge, and the flue are all done at one time. So I start this deeper than it needs to be. And actually what I do is, when I have routed the blanks, I turn the blank on end on my router, and I put in the bit that's going to carve out this channel, and I set the depth so that it will be just a little closer in than 1/8 wall thickness of the bore. So it's going to make for a pretty deep channel here at first, but eventually the flute is going to be shaped down to a 1/8 inch wall on the flute, and this will be, not anywhere near as thick as it is here, and it still needs to be sanded down flat for the final finishing. So when you're fashioning this, you let me find the right one here. I think this is it. Yeah. When you're fashioning that, keep in mind this is how the flute's going to be configured. This is about a 3/8 inch. It can vary, but I find 3/8 works real well. And this is the slow air chamber, this being the bore. This is the exit, and this is a real important part here. Everything needs to be smooth. The goal in making a flute is to have nice, smooth airflow. If you're making this area after you've glued the flute and you start drilling, you can get little shavings and burrs and curls of wood in here. And you'll try as you will, you won't get a good sound, because that wood is making turbulence, and turbulence is going to give you a messed up sounding flute. Guarantee you that. I had one that was like that, and I could not get a good sound. I tried and tried and tried, and I was looking at it from different angles, trying to see what was wrong, and I noticed looking through here that I could see a burl. So I turned the flute up on end and blew real hard right in here, and it came shooting out the other end, and the flute sounded beautiful. So you want this being sloped and beveled. 45-degree angle is fine. You don't need a sharp edge here. So you bevel this edge, and you bevel and round this edge so that the air comes in, builds up some pressure here, and goes up. It has a nice smoothing exit, and it's going to strike the block that'll be setting up here, and it'll be directed down the flue here, and it'll be a nice steady thin stream of air, and it's going to be aimed at the splitting edge, which will split the airflow up to here and down into here. And that's the basics. So whenever you're drilling your hole to make this area, you want to drill it right at the end of the slow air chamber so that you don't have any backflow, and you're trying to get where there is a nice smooth wall coming up here. So you're going to drill your hole down, then you're going to take whatever hobby files you can and widen that hole out so that when you widened it out, it's as wide as the width of the flue, and you don't want to go more than, say, 1/4 of an inch from this edge to this edge. You don't want more than 1/4 of an inch. So whatever it takes for you to do that, you want to start. And this is all done looking from the top of here. You're working. This is a side view cut from on the vertical plane so that you can see but you're going to work from up on the top with your file coming down into here. So you're going to make a nice channel first, and then you're going to take your flat file and start filing this way. Now, I'm not really trying to get into the woodworking aspects. I'm just trying to explain how this is formed. Once you've got your hole drilled, you widen it with a square file, and then you take a flat file and start shaping and rounding off this edge here. This one, you do the same thing, but if you notice, I've got an offset here. It's I think they call it a back set. But this allows for a certain amount of backflow as the air is entering. It's going to have some circulation. It's not going to just come in a nice thin stream and shoot down here. It's going to start trying to fill this chamber. So I find it has an effect on the tone of the flute. Some makers make them without backset. I like the backset. I've made them both ways. I just prefer the backset. So you want this to be, you notice this arc coming up here from the router, right where it begins to get flat is where I drill my hole. And then I widen it with a square file, and then I take a flat chisel or one of my coarse hobby files, and I begin to make this ramp so that I've got the ramp on this end and a ramp on this end, and this is nowhere near the depth that it needs to be from north to south. I just need a nice thin slot and the beginnings of a bevel. Once you glue this together, your hobby files are going to tend to bang into the bottom of this flute, and if you don't have this already started, they're going to be straight up and down, and you're going to make 10,000 little bitty strokes. But if you get it started, then your file is at an angle. It's got much more travel available. You're going to take less strokes to get the job done. So the theory for this true sound hole is you blow into here, the air hits a restriction here in this thin flue area, so pressure builds up here, and that pressure is relieved at a steady rate coming into this flue area. If you didn't have this and you blew, you would have turbulence in your air, and you wouldn't have anything to smooth out the flow. It makes a much different sounding flute. So maybe a recorder might be a good example of that, how they sound. So this is a very important part of the flute. It needs to be nice and smooth on the walls, and you know, sand it out a little bit. Some people take a torch and they scorch the bore in this area here. I don't like the taste of burnt wood. You sand it out pretty good, and if you seal it, that's great. I oil my flutes. I don't seal them in any kind of finish, though. I may start doing that if I start selling them and I get complaints about they're not shiny and all that. I personally like to feel a piece of wood in my hands when I'm playing the flute, and not some varathane or highly polished varnish. It's just a personal preference. I like a flute to kind of feel like and look like, whenever you pick it up, that you've picked up something out of a cave down somewhere in Arizona. It's just the way I like it. So anyway, nice smooth airflow. Reduce as much turbulence as you can by making all the edges smooth, burr-free. You know, sand them a little bit if you can. You need to keep your sharp edges where they need to be sharp, and anything associated with this flue area right through here needs to have nice crisp edges. This edge needs to be nice and crisp and sharp and at 90 degrees. And then this one is about 35 to 45 degrees, give or take. I use a hobby file. I don't use anything to measure it. I just kind of look with my eye, and I get it at an angle that I think is the right one. A lot of it is based on experience, but 45. This little area right here, the actual splitting edge is not sharp. You get it real thin, but it is not sharp. You want to have a slight blunt on that. So again, smooth in, or you blow in, it gets smoothed out, pressurized, and released in a nice, steady, even, smooth stream. Flows down, hits the splitting edge, and is split here into here. And actually what makes the pitch or the vibration, the sound, when you hit the splitting edge, air is diverted into the chamber, into the bore, and it's diverted out. It's split. Okay, as it enters here, it begins building up a pressure, and that pressure causes it to want to go more this way where there's less resistance. So you're filling this chamber with air. The back pressure is relieving that, or kind of blocking that flow, causing it to go up. And once this pressure is released, because it's flowing up here, it begins to flow back in, generates more pressure. So it's going in and out, and it's going on an A, it would go 440 times a second. And that's just a very crude explanation. There's much that goes into generating that tone, but that oscillation is one of the key aspects of it. And that may just be my opinion. Maybe I'm kidding myself. So I want to take a look at the whole mechanism. This is a block, fetish or totem, whatever you want to call it. So it's just another view of the sound mechanism itself. Air comes in, strikes the bottom, and it's forced down this thin, flat flue, strikes this cutting edge here, the splitting edge. So as I make the flute, I put the block on it, hold it down. You can use a rubber band, or you can just hold it with your hand, whatever. Some people clamp them down just so they can test, but I find holding is enough. I listen to see if I get any kind of a sound at all, and most of the time you don't, because this distance isn't enough. So I begin to sand this flat area around the flue, making it smaller, shorter, or less depth. And now what you're doing there is you're making that fine-tuning that stream of air. At the same time, you want to move this edge out. The rule that you want to follow here, and make this a hard and fast rule, you do not want the distance from this surface to this splitting edge to be more than 7/32 of an inch. As the air comes out of this flue, it's directed in a thin stream air. The further out you go from there, if you took this out of the picture, this edge, the further out you go, the more dispersed or diffused this stream would become. And so if you put this too far out here, you're not going to have a thin stream striking the splitting edge. You're going to have a puff of wind hitting it. It's not going to be able to split and pressurize like it should. So what happens is it turns the sound of the flute into breathy. And you've probably heard some breathy flutes from people that have made or bought a cheap flute, made one that wasn't quite right. The flute is too deep, so you don't have this thin stream, or the true sound hole is too long, and it'll make it breathy. If it's too short, it tends to be brassy sounding, and I find for me that right at 7/32, give or take a couple of hairs, that is where the sweet spot is. So you begin to move this out, sharpen this, and fine-tune this dimension here, the depth of the flue, and do it all at one time. So bring it down a little bit and listen. Move it out a little bit and listen. Sharpen it a little bit and listen. Bring it down a little bit and listen. Sharpen it a little bit, just back and forth. Small, you don't want to file off a noticeable. You just want to make a few passes so that you can say, yeah, I've moved it forward a little bit. And then you listen again. Small changes make big differences. So small steps. Try to maintain this good angle here. This needs to be like, if you have a sharp pencil and you draw a line, that's how thick that edge needs to be, but it's not sharp. So once you've got your nice sound there, you'll find you can aim this air at this edge by moving this block back and forth. So usually when you make a good flute, you have this block and this edge are aligned. If you move it back, it tends to release the air, and it tends to want to go up because it's still being guided by the bottom edge, but it's not any longer guided by the top. So it's trying to go up. If you move it forward of this line, then it's trying to direct the air down. So as you move it back and forth, you're effectively aiming that airstream at that edge. If you can't seem to get it aimed and you think it's not sounding quite good yet, you're already at your 7/32. You can take a file and very slightly put a bevel on this corner right here, which brings the splitting edge down into the airflow. If you've got that about as far down as you think you can possibly put it, and any further is going to wreck your flute, you might try a chamfer here. But I have found that of all the flutes that I've made, and I don't know, 100, I keep giving them away and I don't keep track of them. But of all the flutes that I've made, I have 0 flutes that have had to have any work done on in the way of a chamfer or bevel on either one of these surfaces. They always come out good by taking time, working slow, small changes, and go for that pencil lead thickness on this edge here, and credit card depth here. If you get those 2 elements right and 7/32, you'll 9 times out of 10 you'll have a flute that is working good. Probably, and I've never tried it, if I made this exactly credit card depth, made it exactly 7/32 and nice angle and all that, and then put the block on it, probably would sound fine. But I like to work my way up to it, because just like a guitarist has pickup selections. You can get a nice rich bassy tone. You can get a real thin bright sound by using the bridge pickup. I like flutes to have different sounds. Now, I don't like every flute that I make to be a very clear, high-pitched, that kind of a thing. Some flutes, I like a soft sound to them. So, and bigger flutes, the deeper tones tend to be softer anyway, but by working this a little bit at a time, sometimes you can find a real nice sounding flute that isn't bright with a sharp cutting edge, but it still sounds beautiful. Anasazi style flutes don't have that bright sound. They have a mellow sound. So maybe you don't always want it to sound a certain way. By making it a little bit at a time, you can come up to something that you think sounds real sweet and stop right there. So enough said on that. The rule again, smooth, less turbulence. 0 turbulence is ideal. Never more than 7/30 seconds here. This is about a 45-degree angle. This is 90. This is rounded, and this is angled. If you can get that and get those dimensions right, odds are your flute's going to sound just fine. So that pretty much is the nitty-gritty of the sound mechanism. So let me find another view here. Well, that's not the one. There we go. Let's use that one. So now you come to the tuning. You got this blank. You've got it routed on the insides. You got your true sound hole made, and the flue mechanism, all that's made, and the block's made. So mount the block, blow into the flute, and put it up to a tuner and take a listen. It'll be way flat, probably several tones if you've cut more than you need. So you begin cutting off pieces and checking, and you just keep cutting it off and checking using thin slices. You'll begin to see how much difference it makes as you cut. So you just want to take care not to cut too far. If you do go too far, turn your G into an F sharp. But try to stay below with your cuts. Try to stay below the pitch, and then finish it off with a file. And then once you've got it up to pitch, you're ready to start doing the finger holes. And another reason why you might want to cut it long, you might want a closed-end flute. And this is one that I made for a friend. It's this one is a B minor. It's a pretty small flute. But when I routed it out, I did not route all the way to the end. I left an area for the, what's the term they use, effigy, the carving, or whatever term you might want to use. And then I used tuning holes. So the thing with tuning holes is it's just like putting in a finger hole. It creates a higher pitch by shortening the tube. So if you make the tuning holes, when they equal half of the diameter of the flute bore, it's the same effect as cutting off the end of the flute. So whatever you have out here is not relevant. If you just want a flute that's longer in the look of the flute, you can use tuning holes so you can make your flute longer, but effectively have a short flute. So there's lots of good reasons for using tuning holes. You want to drill about where you feel that the length of the flute would actually be. If this were a G minor flute, this would be around 15.5 inches. I'd go a little bit south of that and then make the hole larger, bringing this edge closer this way as you make it larger till you get to the pitch that you want. So tuning holes I like them. I don't always make them. It just depends on how much time I want to take. And does the flute look balanced already? If it does, you don't need tuning holes. If it looks really short, but you've got this long 4, 5, 6 inch piece back here, you might want to extend this end out. Tuning holes is arbitrary, whatever you want to do with that. So back to the Where do you place the holes? So there's, if you want to be precise and you're a person that really likes to keep track of everything and make sure that it's exactly mathematically like it's supposed to be, blah, 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 then go out and buy a book. R.A. Wolf puts out one called Flute Shop. It is very detailed. It has excellent diagrams and charts to guide you through the process of selecting the bore size and the length, and the placement of the finger holes is exact. He talks about making Lakota style flutes, a tube flute, many of the different styles of flutes. It's an excellent book. It's well worth the purchase price if you're going to really get serious about being real technical and making. Maybe you want to make each flute the same, that kind of thing. I would get a book, but you can also make a flute with the grandfather method. You can measure from your armpit to the tip of your fingers. That's the length of the flute overall. You measure from the inside of the elbow to the tip of the fingers. That's the bore length. The sound air chamber, you come in a couple of fingers and then do a hand width, and that gives you the slow air chamber. So you can make your tuning holes 1 thumb width from the end. Then you go to the center of the flute and make your marks based from the center. So I'm going to talk to you about how I do it. This is not a grandfather method. This is just one of the ways that I do it. I like to go to places like Flutepedia.com. They've got a wonderful flute calculator there. There's another one, Tao of Walking Ridge, I think, Tao of Walking Ridge. He has a flute calculator. I kind of look at those, see what they say, look at the method that I'm using, compare them so that I can satisfy myself when I drill that hole it's not going to be wrong. So this is how I do it. And some people might say, well, that's not a good way to do it, but I get it done. To me, if it is in tune and sounds good, it's a good flute. I could care less what it looks like. So anyway, you're going to take a measurement from here to here, from the foot end of the flute to the end of the actually you want to measure. Let me get this in front of us here. You want to measure from this edge, the splitting edge, that from there down to the foot end of the flute. That's what you want to measure. Then cut that in half. So you're going to make a line. Let me get up here to the right level. Okay, you're going to make. Oh, I got something selected here. Bear with me. For some reason, I'm not able to draw here. Oh, there we go. Looks like I have been drawing. I had the layer hidden. So you're going to make a line here. Let me erase that. Like I say, this is unrehearsed, so you're going to hear some bobbles. I might stammer a lot, whatever, but this is unrehearsed. Just right off the cuff as I work this morning and sip on my coffee. So the halfway measurement, you make a line. Now you place your thumb so that it's on the left edge of the thumb would be your lined up with this line, and then you're going to make another mark right here. And that is a thumb width, and this is not the scale. I'm just eyeballing this. So you're going to make a mark. That's hole number 3. And then you're going to go another thumb width, and you want to put some pressure on so your thumb widens out a bit. I find that for me is about the same as the distance from the knuckle of the index finger to the knuckle of the long finger. So I put my knuckles down here, and I put my index finger knuckle here, and then I make a mark at the long finger knuckle. And then I make another one the same way here. And that is the 3 bottom holes. Then you do the same process here. You measure up a thumb width and make a hole. Then you measure up a knuckle width or a thumb width and make a hole. And obviously this piece of wood is way too long. So this doesn't look proportionally like it would be correct. So you just have to imagine that this is shorter and this is up where it looks more natural. But that's simply how it's done. That's how you mark it out. If you want to make a true sound, the tuning hole, you're just going to make it anywhere that the distance you think it needs to be the right one. Make your mark and start drilling your tuning holes. So this is how you lay it out. If you notice here, this line being center, that is where hole number 6 would be if you were making a 6-hole flute. You would make a hole right there. Okay, so once you got them marked out, you drill pilot holes. The way I make a flute, I do the first hole completely before I go to the second hole. Each hole, this hole will affect the sound of this hole, or the tone or pitch. This one affects these two. So as you keep drilling holes, this changes. It usually will lower because you're increasing the volume of the chamber. So probably the best way to do it is to drill all 6 pilot holes first. Make 6 small holes in the place where they should be. Cover these holes and take a reading on this one. Then you start increasing the size of this one gradually. And I find that once I've drilled a hole, if I try to drill a larger hole, it'll start splitting out, splintering, chipping out the wood. I reverse the drill, and it doesn't do that. So I drill my hole the normal way with the small, and we're talking, you know, a drill that's, I don't have my drill set right in front of me to get a size for you, but if you think about the size of the ballpoint pen, that little tip that sticks out, that's about the size you want to drill that first hole. Then you start enlarging it. If you find that you're going for, on a G minor flute, it would be A sharp. So if you're going for an A sharp, and this is down below A, that means the hole is too far south. You're not going to be able to get it up to the right pitch without having this enormous hole here. So you've got 2 options. You can plug the hole with a splinter of wood glued in, or you can use a matchstick, because a matchstick is going to be, you know, hard to press into that hole if your pilot hole is small enough, like it should be. You can plug the hole and re-drill, or as you start with your next largest bit, you want to position the bit so that the center is north of the hole, of the center of this hole, and that the edge of the bit just takes in the hole itself. And then as you go larger with each bit, you keep doing that same process. I like to angle my bit coming in from an angle like this, and then as it starts to go into the wood, I begin to straighten it out so it's coming in more straight, and that effectively moves the hole up. And you can keep doing that as you enlarge the hole, and you can actually move it quite a considerable distance by doing that. And if you watch your tuner, you'll start seeing that what was below A is only slightly larger, but now it's an A, maybe 20 cents above an A. And if you think you're close enough, you can stop moving the hole and just keep enlarging the hole. Experience is what teaches you what's going to work and what isn't. And by the same token, if you find out that it's supposed to be an A sharp and it's a B already, then you would angle your hole the other way and try to make the hole larger without raising the pitch. If it's above a B, you're stuck. You're going to have to plug that hole and move the hole down, because you can't make a hole smaller. You can only make it larger. So unless I mean, you can make a hole smaller using some wood sawdust and super glue or Type Bond. You can make a concoction and fill in the hole. I mean, I've done that before. But essentially, if it's already at pitch or higher when you make the first hole, it's probably better to just move the hole. If you don't want to have a spot where you plugged it, then the blanks cost you what, $5? Just go buy another one, start over. Whatever you feel like you need to do. But enlarging it until it gets almost right to pitch. Then do your next hole, and if you go back and check with each hole that you make, this is likely going to flatten just a little bit. So keep fashioning the holes till you get all 5 fashioned near pitch. Then check the overall pitch of your flute. Shave off more if you need to bring it up a little bit, and then make another pass down through here tuning, and then check this, make another pass until you get everything well within tolerances. And for me, when I make a flute, tolerance is right on, dead on. Each note needs to be dead on. And there's a lot of people that say, concert tuned flute. That's just a flute that's tuned to pitch. But you're going to find out in the real world, a wooden flute is going to change pitch whenever you take it outside, you bring it inside. I sometimes use a heat lamp instead of a heater in my workroom, because it just gives me some nice localized heat right where I'm sitting. And I don't necessarily like to change the ambient temperature in the room because of my guitars and things. They're all being affected by temperature changes. So if I come into a room and it's comfortable, sometimes I'll just turn on heat lamp right where I'm sitting. Well, that heat lamp will heat the flute as I'm playing or working with it and change the tuning. So if you're going to play in a concert in Arizona and it's going to be 90 degrees and you tune your flute at 72 degrees, you're going to be out of tune when you get there. So how do you compensate for that? You make more than one flute. There are charts and graphs out there that can tell you how much to allow in variance. If you're in a 72 degree room and you're going to play at an 80 degree concert, you can make a flute. You can tune it so that it'll be on pitch at 80 degrees by varying the pitch a certain number of cents, and there's formulas for all that. But that's getting beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here today. Today it's just, let's make a nice sounding flute. And so mine are usually tuned at 70 to 72 degrees. That's normally the temperature in my room here. I've come in the mornings to wake up with a song to record, and my A flute is playing at G sharp, and I've had it go as low as G because it's cold. And so I put it near the heat lamp and start heating it up, and I keep messing around with it and playing it until it comes back to the pitch that it's supposed to be. The other option, if you've got good software, you can record it even if it's a little flat because of the temperature. You can compensate for that with tune correction, just the same way they make a lot of these singers nowadays. They make them sing on pitch by using auto tune. You can do the same thing with a flute. You can adjust the pitch slightly. It doesn't change the way the flute sounds. It doesn't take away from the artistic expression, but it puts it back on true pitch. So a person does have to deal with temperature changes and all that. So when you're going out to play with other musicians, depending on where you're at and the weather conditions, they may have to tune their guitars a little bit to match you, because it's they don't make tunable flutes that I'm aware of in Native American style. So at any rate, I think I've covered it all. The basic rule is make everything smooth as possible when you're making that airflow. Think of that airflow being just as smooth as it can be. And the more you can do towards making it smooth, the better off you're going to be as far as the way the flute sounds. do all of your fashioning of the true sound hole in small steps. Small steps can make a big change. So you want to do it nice and smooth, and do your best not to make big changes. Same when you're tuning the flute. If you're going to enlarge the hole, if you've got 64-bit or 64-inch, 1/64 of an inch increments in your drill set, that's what you want to use. Take it up very slowly, and if you get anywhere near you think the next drill bit size is going to make it too high, then stop using the drill, get yourself out a round hobby file, and begin rounding it out by hand with a file. If you've got burning rods, you can do that method too. I personally, it hardens the surface. It makes it helps the voice, but I don't like the taste of burnt wood when I'm playing the flute. So I've got the burning rods. I seldom use them because I don't like the taste of burnt wood. So I think that covers everything. If you've got questions about anything I've said, or if I've left something out, again, this is an impromptu recording. I did not rehearse this. I'm not working off a script. If I've missed something or not been clear, feel free to, private message me, ask me a question, and I'll answer it the best of my abilities. So I think that concludes it. Happy fluting.